The next morning was greeted with moans and groans. Blisters had risen. Backs ached. Sliding their feet into cold, sandy river sneakers was torture. The pastor cheerfully encouraged everyone, saying that they'd be sleeping on a bed that night. The group set out. As the day progressed, spirits rose. The soreness was worked out of tired shoulders, and the thrill of navigating rapids to see what was around the next bend kept everyone occupied. They stopped for lunch on a small island in the middle of the river and swam for an hour. As the sun dropped behind a ridge, the leader signaled a stop ahead. The canoes pulled onto the pebbly wash of a dry creek. "And the beds?" asked the campers, looking around doubtfully. "Oh, you're standing in it," grinned the pastor. "A creek bed." That night everyone took turns stretching out on their sleeping bags to receive a back rub and a shoulder massage. Eddie's canoe partner, one of the girl counselors, asked him to rub her shoulders. He'd never been too close to a girl before, and he wasn't sure how to give a massage, but he didn't want to let his partner down. She started to make happy little sounds. He was amazed. He rubbed in circles, pressed harder, tried a few little karate chops, and she kept making these happy sounds. When he finished, she called her co-counselor over. "Hey, you got to try this. Eddie gives wonderful back rubs." He gingerly placed his hands on her shoulders and began to move them in circles. It was like magic. She started to make the same sounds. Wow! He didn't know who was having more fun, the counselor or himself. The next day the group pushed off again and headed downstream. They came to a part of the river where the current divided into several smaller streams separated by wooded islands. At the head of each island, large ramparts of dead trees and driftwood had washed up during floods. It made him wonder what this peaceful river might look like in high water. The canoes split up, each one exploring a different channel. Eddie and his partner threaded through a tight entrance and entered a long green waterway with ancient sycamore trees rising like pillars in a cathedral along both sides. Up ahead they saw one of the trees leaning out over the water. As they got closer, Eddie could see the trunk was covered by large brown bumps. Then one of the bumps moved. There were about 20 unsuspecting mud turtles sunning themselves on the log. Eddie wanted to get closer. His partner didn't. But Eddie was in the back of the canoe, and guess who steers? Why, Eddie! He maneuvered the boat closer, and the turtles began to get alarmed. He slid the bow under the trunk, and the turtles panicked. They began to bail out, landing in chunky splashes all around the canoe. One or two banged off the gunnels, and Eddie's partner erupted in a screaming fit. Eddie was laughing so hard he could barely back paddle. For the next couple of miles, Eddie's partner refused to speak to him. The next day was marked by long stretches of slow water. Large fish could be seen swimming slowly across a sandy bottom. After lunch, the pastor made sure everyone secured their belongings and checked the knots on their lashing. Before nightfall, they would be hitting Bacon Falls. As the afternoon wore on, the tension rose. Around each bend, the campers expected to see the rocky palisades that marked the falls. Finally, a little before sunset, they heard an ominous roar coming from downstream. They paddled around one last bend, saw the cliffs, and noticed that the river seemed to disappear. Their leader signaled a halt on the rocky shore above the falls and got out to reconnoiter. The campers followed. They watched the water slide glassily into the upper stretch of the rapids and turn to foam. The current pushed waves up against the base of the cliff. Water broke over the boulder that guarded the exit. Below the rapids, standing waves died out in a pool of still water. "Okay, this is it," said the pastor. The deep water is on the right side, against the cliff. Try to fend off of the rocks as much as you can. If anything goes wrong and you flip, keep away from your canoe and float down with your feet out in front of you. Good luck with the boulder." And they were off. The first boat entered the rapids and began to pick up speed. They bounced down a couple of ledges and slid against the cliff. The campers pushed off with their paddles and managed to keep going. At the bottom, they ruddered left as hard as they could and just missed the boulder. They lifted their paddles in victory in the still water below. The second canoe followed. Halfway down, the bow struck the rock cliff and the stern swung into the current. The campers had no time to correct, and the canoe swept past the boulder backwards. Upright and intact, the campers gave a whoop. Eddie and his partner entered the current. He skillfully managed to avoid the rocks and ledges. Approaching the cliff, he angled himself away and paddled hard. Success! Almost home free. He angled for the left side of the boulder, but his partner angled for the right. The canoe struck the boulder broadside. Its downstream side was lifted on the pillowing water, and the upstream side of the canoe began to take on water. Eddie threw a leg over the side and pushed off with all his might, but it was too late. The canoe had filled to the gunwales. With a supreme effort, they managed to pry the boat off the rock. Eddie and his partner, with water up to their armpits, paddled through the standing waves at the bottom of the rapid. They ignominiously accepted the rescue rope thrown to them and dragged themselves to the sandy bank. That evening, they camped within the sound of Bacon Falls. Eddie's wet things hung near the fire to dry. While the others were setting up a campsite, Eddie hiked upstream to revisit the site of his demise. The river was full of rocks, and on a whim, he turned one over. To his surprise, there were several large crawdads hiding underneath. He turned over another and found several more. It seemed all the crawdads from the still water upstream had congregated in this one place. Forgetting all about his wedding, Eddie ran back to the campsite and grabbed a bailing bucket. With a couple of friends, he returned to the falls and in no time had a bucket full of large crawdads. They returned triumphantly to the camp and set a pot of water on to boil. That night, they enjoyed a hillbilly delicacy, boiled crawdads. The only thing better was the nightly back rub. When the week ended, it was time to go home, Eddie shook hands with his fellow campers. He looked around for his counselors, but they were in a staff meeting. Disappointed, he started walking toward the parking lot. But before he reached the car, the two girls came running out of the lodge. He turned around in surprise. First one, and then the other, planted a big kiss on him. Wow! It was another new experience. Eddie realized kissing was even better than back rubs. He decided then and there he was definitely coming back to camp.